Welcome, this is another CS232 video. Today we will be talking about the Collatz sequence given an integer by the user. This code is written in C++. So the Collatz sequence is a series of numbers calculated according to the following rules. If n is even, divide by 2, and if it is odd, then we want to multiply it by 3 and add 1. So we will repeat this process until the end number is 1, as we can see with this example here. How we start with 9 and eventually we get to 1. So how I started with this was to find the longest sequence of the inputted number by the user, then calculate the longest sequence that we get from this, and store the longest sequence in a linked list. Then we will traverse it to display to the user, and finally get rid of the memory by deleting all the nodes. So the code starts by declaring a struct called Collatz node. Inside the struct, we have two members, an integer called item and a pointer to a Collatz node called link. In our main function, it initializes several variables, including the length of the Collatz sequence, the longest sequence found so far, and the number that produced the longest sequence. It also creates two Collatz nodes, the head and the next Collatz node. The user is then prompted to enter an integer, 100 or less. This integer is stored into the item next Collatz node item. The code then loops through every integer from 1 up to the input integer, calling the Collatz sequence function for each integer to calculate the length of its Collatz sequence. If the length of the sequence is longer than the longest sequence found so far, the variables longest and longest num are updated to store the length of the number that is produced in that sequence. If the length of the sequence is longer than the longest sequence found so far, the variables longest and longest num are updated to store the length and the number that produced that sequence. After the loop, the code creates a linked list containing the terms of the longest Collatz sequence. It does this by starting at the last term of the sequence, which is the number that produced the sequence, and repeatedly adding a new node to the linked list with the previous term in the sequence until the first term, which is always 1, is reached. The Collatz sequence function then takes an integer as a parameter and returns the length of its Collatz sequence using our rules from earlier. If it is even, then we will divide it by 2, and if it is odd, then we will multiply it by 3 and add 1. It uses a while loop to repeatedly apply the rules of the Collatz sequence until the result is 1, counting the number of terms in the sequence as it goes. Finally, the code prints out the terms of the linked list separated by arrows, then deletes all of the nodes in the linked list to free up memory. So let's go ahead and run it. So I will be using the example. So I will enter in 10 and it should give us 9 produces the longest Collatz sequence. So let's enter 10, enter. Yep. The number 9 produces the longest Collatz sequence of 20 terms. And that's it. With this code, you can calculate the Collatz sequence of any integer and find the longest sequence up to 100.